gods and all this. But you go to one of their churches and what do you see? You see people dancing. You see people getting possessed by the Holy Ghost. You see people exorcising witches. They've actually, it's actually, but the most important thing is that they're prosperity religions. If you talk to the Christians, they say they belong to the prosperity churches, which means that God doesn't show his blessing to you when you're dead and gone. It's in this life. Now, another word for prosperity is fertility. The old African fertility religions weren't there for when you're dead. When you're dead, you're dead. It was for the living. So what the Africans have done is they've reconverted Christianity back into a living religion, which it was probably at the time of Jesus. People danced, they drank wine, they had agapa, love feasts. It was the European take on Christianity that changed it into a death cult. And this is why, because the Europeans became so good at making weapons of mass destruction or war, slavery. It was because it was their underpinning. So what's going to happen, I think, and it's probably already happening, is that African missionaries are going into Europe to proselytize or evangelize the godless natives, the white natives. I mean, this is a big change in the world. The whites came here to bring God to a people who were already godly, except they didn't believe in one God, they had many gods. And now the West has become godless. I'm not talking about America. America's a different kettle of fish. America's very godly, but what type of God it is there is another matter. But they're very religious, the Americans. But the Europeans are no longer. So you're going to have black missionaries, and people, the whites will be attracted because look, these people are worshipping God on their feet, dancing, enjoying themselves, seeing miracles. It's not you just kneel down and and pretend to be miserable, so you might go to heaven. So this is one difference. I mean, this is what I meant by the humanizing possibility of African culture. They take a religion that was once a godly religion of the Jews and of Jesus and slaves in Rome, and it was converted into this monstrous religion that we have in the West. I mean, I'm not saying 100%, but generally, look at the Catholic faith, and the Protestants are even worse. The Protestants were the worst of all. I mean, they were the most racist. American Puritans, the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa, the apartheid system. So it became, and it's a civilization that blessed the manufacture of atomic weapons and everything. So it's turned from a life force, which a religion should be, whether you believe in God or not. I'm not talking about that, but the basis of religion is it's meant to make you. I mean, the original religion of human beings was hunt magic, shamans. For getting more meat. So it wasn't for when you're dead. It was when you're family. So religion has always played that role. But in Europe, it's become a death cult. I'm not saying because Jesus is strung on a cross, because there are many religions where you have the religious hero being sacrificed and then being reborn. Isis and Osiris. There were so many. Mithras. There were many religions like this. But what's happened in the last 100 years in Europe is, first of all, they excluded women. We have in Europe now, in Christianity, even Islam, religions which are totally masculine. They totally remove the female principle at a spiritual level. So it only left the macho, the hunter, the killer spirit. So somehow I think the humanism within Christianity was lost. And it's just become, that's why it's become an empty shell to most Europeans. But the answer isn't to become godless, or not to have it, or to be, maybe I shouldn't use the word God. I mean, you can still be very godly and not believe in God, to be a humanist. But you see, because the religion itself is no longer humanistic. How can you have a religion that doesn't allow people to dance, doesn't allow women to be holy, and so on? And also is always going on holy wars and crusades, like Iraq, Afghanistan. These were all crusades. Libya, these are all crusades. So I think what they've done in Africa, and it's not just in Ghana, is the churches have reformatted Christianity and made it this worldly, and I think that's a very big difference. And it means that it becomes a life force rather than death force. And that's why maybe the whites in Europe are flocking to the black churches. Not it's because a life force means it's enjoyment. You
Yeah.
can actually laugh and believe in God and dance and believe
Yeah.
in God. It's
Yeah.
not a sin.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Okay.
this is my take on that.
Interesting. If we should change maybe the subject a little to art music, you had a Pan-African orchestra
Yes.
and Labi
Yes,
and
Labi, yeah.
composers like that. Is there anything like it today?
Oh yes, it's still going very strong.
Okay.
The choral side of art music, developed by Ephraim Amu, is very, very. I mean, I was involved with a report for Musica on the Ghana music industry, and we couldn't actually calculate the number of choral groups who play a type of sort of African form of handle. It's a sort of art music. You could say 10,000 groups performing, but they're not commercial, but nevertheless they're there. And then in terms of the more art university level academic, we in the case of Nana Danso, the Pan-African Orchestra, he actually, before he died, he brought his group into a church. It's called, I forgot the name of the church, but it's a guy called Antabil, Reverend Antabil, Bishop Antabil. I mean, I met him, and this guy has decided that he's going to intervene into music. So he set up a symphonic orchestra called the Accra Orchestra, which has got nothing to do with the National Orchestra, but plays. There's no words to this music, so you can't say it's Christian music. It's just instrumental music, but with an African flavor. And Nana Danso was involved in setting this up, and I think there's another group. I think he has an operatic group that combined with African drums. It's quite experimental what Otabil is doing. But it's come out of the university. It's not within the university system. The universities are still there producing art musicians, but in the Legon, where I am, in the University of Ghana at Legon, it's still largely choral. It's choral. A lot of the students are doing choral music or doing MAs or MPhils, graduates in choral music, choral composition. I can't really say that it's still very much a minority. It's not the mainstream of Ghana is popular music. It always has been, because even by definition, it's the people's music,
of course,
and it's not the elite's music. So I would still say that art music in Ghana is sort of flavored with the church, and not even just with the church, because the church now has two different musical forms of music. It has the gospel, the choral music, which you don't normally dance to, you sway, but they have gospel music, which is the biggest thing in the whole country. Hey, come on. Gospel music is the biggest. I mean, that is the dominant music of Ghana, and it's from the church, but it's not the choral music. It's popular dance music played with dance band instruments, and it's been going since the 70s, when the unemployed highlight musicians moved into the churches, which you met all those years ago. So even within the church, the dominant form of music is not the art form of choral music, although it's important. It's gospel music. And if you don't allow people to dance in church, you cannot get congregations. But the art music itself is still, especially the one in the university, is tiny. It's very tiny. But the university will have an orchestra, and there's a national orchestra, and so on. So, and quite a lot of people traveled abroad, like Labi, he's in America, and there's a guy called New Love Anand who went to America, but he's recently come back. But I wouldn't say that it's a booming side of the music scene in Ghana.
And they are all coming from the universities?
Except if they come through the church choral. Choir masters, I'm talking about choir masters.
Yes, okay.
Yes. Some of those will come to the university to do some extra, get some degrees or something, but some of it is done, it's not connected directly with the university, but it's to do with the churches, the more orthodox churches tend towards the choral, like the Presbyterians and so on. And the churches that go into the gospel actually are the more local proletarian churches. And not only that, if you take the case of the EP Church, which is a church based I think it came out of the Brahmin mission or the Basel mission way back. It was a sort of Africanized church, and by the 40s they were using African choral hymns like Ephraim Amu style in Ewe. But then there was a split in the church. I think it was in the 70s or 80s. I think it was in the 80s. There was an actual split in the church that the younger members wanted to also include dance. Gospel, this would be classed as gospel music. And the older members refused. So the church split on this issue, basically, the utilization of dance, because the older branch of the church still held on to the European conception that dancing is a sin. See?
Yeah.
But now, of course, those who hold on to that belief don't get any, what do you call it, congregations.
No, okay. What about the rhythm and the harmonics? Is it still the same as it were, or has there been a shift? In European music, a lot of non-musicians are now making music, so they don't use that many chords anymore.
Or simplification.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, of course, hip life, Burger High Life, but particularly hip life, is a great example of that, because that generation were not exposed to live music because of the military era. The bands died, or they ran away, the musicians ran away. And also they took music out of the education system in 1988. So that hip life generation grew up without a lot of live musical input. They weren't interested in traditional music, but in terms of modern music, they weren't getting any input. High life wasn't there. So what they did is they just used drum machines. And that's why the hip lifers don't have bands. They make friends with an engineer who lays down the tracks. So, but I would say that something's interesting been happening recently. I've noticed it about 3 or 4 years ago. Is that in terms of the more modern types of hip life, which are drawing on African music, and also the contemporary high life, they're often extremely polyphonic. And there are layers of music, and you can, if you think about it, a multi-tracks, African music, traditional music, is perfect for a multi-track studio.
It's locking.
Yes, and you can all the polyphonic layers, and you can isolate them and rebalance them if you like, and you can do them electronically, and you can have some voices with electronic gadgets and so on. And I've noticed there's a lot of that going on at the moment, and some of the contemporary high life uses modal. It doesn't use 1/4/5 harmonies anymore. It uses the modal style of the Akans, which is where the music gravitates or rotates between two tone centers, a tone apart. A lot of traditional Akan music making is based on that, and so is a major form of high life known as a danson. A lot of the palm wine music is based on this modal, even though it's played on a guitar. And Sitchi high life, for instance, or minor types of high life, like Al-Haji Frempong style. So you find that sometimes they won't just use 1/4/5. They're using traditional modalities again, or the modal African way of moving between two tone centers. So I'm not saying it's a major development, but I have noticed that that's going on. And sometimes when I'm listening to very current mixes of hip lifers or contemporary high lifers, but even hip lifers, I'm hearing instruments like the goje fiddle, but it's not the goje fiddle. It's using a keyboard to give that sound. So they're somehow reconstituting polyphonic, polyrhythmic music. And they can, of course, Ghanaians can dance to polyrhythmic music. They have no problems with 6/8. Because it's one of the major forms of dancing in the church. It draws on the Adowa, Agbajaz style, the old polyrhythmic modes. So it's most certainly not all the modern music is in strict 4/4 time. Maybe dance hall is, but some of the hip life is not. So you get other modes and the contemporary high life. So I think what they're doing is they're going back to traditional music making modes, but with electronic expertise. This is where the hip life generation, what it's contributed to the Ghanaian youth is it's made them familiar with high technology. So they're not approaching it. The first hip lifers or the first burger highlifers, were using very primitive drum machines. And they wanted the sound of artificiality to get up the nose of their parents. That was one of the things that annoyed a lot of, oh, it's too artificial. There's, there's these little ping pong sounds or artificial sounds. And people didn't realize the youth were doing it on purpose to distance their music from the older generation. They didn't want the music to sound natural or lifelike. But the younger generation has worked their way through that alienation, or whatever you want to call it, and are now wanting to humanize. It's just like Michael Jackson when he first met the drum machine. It was all drum machine plus Michael Jackson, and then he realized you have to include live drums. So that in Europe we humanized to some degree computer music. I mean, there are all sorts of tricks, rubatos and all sorts of tricks you can do. But this has finally come into this third generation, or whatever you call it, the post-hit life generation, are now free to, because they've learnt the technology, but they don't have to oppose tradition. Because to them, tradition is the hip life people. So this is what I meant by the grandfather, grandparent thing.
If you should name the 3 top popular artists in Ghana right now, or is it at all possible? Is it local based, or is it?
It's all local.
It's all local based.
Yeah. The top, I mean, one is Wiala. She's a northern woman who sings in a sort of neo-soul, contemporary urban. Often sings in her language. I think it's Sisala. She even uses one of my songs, my Afrobeats actually. It's a backing track for one of her songs. So it's Wiala. She's a new person. She looks like Grace Jones, very masculine face.
Okay.
And then for the dance hall, it's Stone Boy. He's who sings more in a Jamaican mode, but it's definitely not just Jamaican music. It's turning into Afro dancehall. And then for Kofi Kanata maybe, or for contemporary high life. These are the top stars. There are others. I've missed so many.
Yeah, of course, it's difficult. One last question. Where are we right now? Can you tell the story about, in a short way, about this high life museum, or what is it about?
The museum. Okay, I mean, well, as you probably know, I started it in 1990. Myself and E.T. Mensah, King Bruce, Paul Mensah, a few mature high life musicians. At that time, we all thought that high life was finished, and that hip life, or then it wasn't even hip life; it was burger high life. It was a sort of techno pop. It was coming to finish off high life music. Then I sort of opened up the place here. I can't remember, the late 90s, and then I even refurbished the place. Got money from the Goethe Institute, the German Goethe Institute, got a lot of digitization equipment and money. So I put the whole place upstairs and had a very large place where people would come and they could do seminars. And then about 6 years ago, this whole area was flooded. My father and me had been my dad had been here since the late 60s. We'd never been flooded, but we have very friendly sawmillers who moved into the area about 20 years ago, and they first of all filled in all the lakes with sawdust, and after filling in the lakes they filled in all the rivers. So basically there was a series of catastrophic floods, which also affected them, by the way. Probably affected 5,000-10,000 people. But the first time we had the real terrible flood, it caught us all by surprise. And you can see that yellow line over there on the wall. That was how high the water went. And it destroyed my museum. I lost about 10% of my archives. So what I did is I got money from the Dutch, of all people, the Prince Claus Fund. And it's an organization that supports man-made disasters that affect cultural property. In fact, it was set up when the Taliban were blowing up the statues of Buddha. And then it was used in Timbuktu when the fundamentalists were destroying all the archives. So I was actually the first person that wasn't a product of war. But because it was man-made, it was like an urban war. It wasn't a real war. I was considered. So they gave me the money, and that I built dikes and dams, raised the land, but I still didn't want to live downstairs where I was living downstairs. So I relocated upstairs, and then I turned the downstairs into a museum. So I'm still operating the museum, so it's still here.
And is it the opening hours?
There are no, I'm still working part-time at Legon, and also I'm teaching at 2 other universities.
Okay.
Though I'm 72, so I can't teach full-time. But usually I make Fridays and Saturdays available.
Okay.
And so sometimes occasionally a Sunday. So I don't, to be honest with BAPMAF, I mean, it's really me plus all the people I work with, and I mean, it's not a sort of it is a registered institution with the government and everything. It's quite, even with UNESCO, I think, or United Nations, UNESCO, I think. But it's something that just evolved because so many people contributed, but I don't really have a committee anymore that runs it. It's really, in fact, you can see the place. Really, I almost gave up after I was flooded. I came very close to. In fact, I nearly gave all my archives to the National Museum, but people advised me not to do that. So in the end, I held on, and so I still have it. And people like the people you met this morning, and I had a German guy coming here yesterday. Sometimes it's a Ghanaian film crew, Ghanaian students. Different people come here. I'll show you the visitors book in a minute.
Yeah.
So it's still running. But the funny thing right now is my main interest in research isn't popular music. I'm going into African musical prehistory, the archaeology of music, because I did archaeology here as a student, 30, 40 years ago. I've always been interested in archaeology and African studies, African prehistory, and medieval kingdoms. And I went on digs, Stone Age and medieval towns in Ghana and so on. And so now that when I retired 2 years ago from full time, I said, no, I'm going to start a new project, which is joining together archaeology and my interest in music. And I discovered that a lot of work's been done on the archaeology of Africa since I'd studied archaeology. But there's nobody who's doing musical archaeology in Africa. There are some people who are looking at evolution of music, hominin evolution, the development of music and language outside, but not much in Africa itself. And sometimes the archaeologists are even missing information. They don't know what the thing is for, and it's obviously a musical instrument or something like this. So I'm sort of sifting through all this material, and I'm sort of halfway through the first book, because it will be more than one book. So I'm actually going into deep history, really, of music, because at my age, I'll be honest with you, I don't really like hip life. In fact, I don't like it. And they have another thing called a zonto, which is this electronic dance music that I didn't mention, but that came up 210, 211. And it's just, but they're using Ghanaian beats, so it's interesting. They use the jammer beats, but it's more geared for, club dancing. It's like house or garage music, Ghanaian. And some people call it Afro beats with an S, not to distinguish it from fellows music. But to be honest, I don't actually enjoy the music. So I'm finding it more and more difficult to keep an active interest in this, keeping tabs on this music. And also there's a new generation who can do it better than I, because they like the music. I like the older music. So I'm still keeping tabs on this music, see what's going on and so on. But my sort of, really the music that I personally love, if you want to know the music I will listen to in my car when I'm driving, it's 1970s or even 1960s Congolese music. And sometimes high life music. And maybe even sometimes, I don't know, the Everly Brothers or it's older, it's because of time.
Yes,
it's bound to happen. So I will still be interested in what's going on, of course, but I've actually become very interested in why human beings are musical at all, and how did music help us evolutionary wise, because there's a school of thought that believes that music was not really critical to human evolution. It was language which was critical, and that music was just a sort of a sideline. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the original language of human beings was a combination of the two, and they later split. And of course the importance of music to any culture, I mean, it's nothing to do with entertainment. It's to do with memory, particularly cultural memory, putting things into musical forms. I mean, using music to identify groupings within a society, like male and female hunting groups, initiation groups. I mean, there are so many reasons you can think about music being important, even at a Stone Age level. And shamanism, in fact, there's a lot of research being done in South Africa right now about rock art. And you know, the rock art we have in Europe, when the paleontologists first discovered it in the 19th century, they just took it as primitive art. These were people who were trying to draw what they saw in nature, and they're beautiful pictures, but they're not perfect with perspective, and you know, as Western art finally became with Rembrandt. It's sort of like the first step towards art. And what's becoming obvious now, by reanalyzing these pictures, or paintings and engravings, is that in fact it was priests who were in trance. You're talking about toadstools and mushrooms. There were the whole. You see, the two ways human beings became. We have evidence we became intelligent. One is stone tools. Well, when there was a real development of stone tool technology, it corresponded to when we became right-handed. And you have this split between the logical side of the brain. And of course, it was always supposed the other side of the brain wasn't very important. Well, the artistic, religious, mystical side of the brain, if you want to call it that, was critical in us developing a sense of interiority. One of the things that distinguishes a human being from an animal is not just that we make tools and make it in a logical fashion, but that we have a sense of internal imagination or internal conversations. And they believe now that this came, the first inklings when we were sort of more or less apes, was some of us woke up in trance states, probably taking certain herbs. They found all sorts of herbs associated with even Neanderthal gravesites. And it was done through music as well. And it first, maybe it was shamans were the first people to, and then it became a universal feature of humanity that we all have an internal imagination, hopefully. I mean, there are some dimwits in the world still. I mean, but basically, and so that music was critical. Trance dance, they call it trance dance, like the San people of Bushmen, they still do it, or in Australian Aborigines, was part, it wasn't a false belief system or a belief in a false magic. It helped us wake up as human beings. And you know, when I first came to Ghana, I was a Marxist, materialist. I've completely changed my point of view on this, because even though I'm not a religious person personally, I've realized that religion was absolutely fundamental in us waking up. You know, first of all, we buried our dead from at least 400,000 years ago. And then the other sign is art. And the art didn't start in Europe, it started in Africa 70,000 years ago. And it seems to be a process of believing in an afterlife and having an internal imagination. And even the various earliest art created by human beings was not animals, it was geometrical patterns. And they come from a physical feature that when you go into a trance, you sometimes can get it by pressing your eyes, you see patterns emerging. These are called entoptic images. Well, when our early ancestors went into trance and saw these, they tried to depict them on cave walls. And this is where we get our sense of interiority, because these things seem to happen inside us. And so for many thousands of years, we were simply putting sort of crosshatch, circles, blobs, all sorts of patterns on cave walls. And gradually this later on evolved into depicting animals. But a lot of those cave paintings of animals have these blobs and dots superimposed on them, because they then became considered as a representation of spiritual energies. But whether you believe in God or not is not the point. The point is that it was that awakening, which was first of all in internalization in dreams or trances, of objects that we actually saw. So in fact it was naturalistic. Human beings saw these dots and images. It wasn't a fantasy at all. It was a real. It was materialistic, Marxist. It was happening in front of your eyes, but when you were in a trance. And so this is the origins of religion. So I've diverted off the topic, but
okay.
I've become really, really interested in how we woke up as human beings, and the functions that music plays in society, and still plays. War songs. You know, when the Americans go to war, they look what they did to. They can use loudspeakers.
Yeah.
Or they march singing songs and so on. I mean, the music still has all these functions. It's not just mere entertainment. And even entertainment is important.
Yeah, of course. The last question, what is music to you?
It's the biggest, it's part of the mystery of why we're human beings. I mean, if we can, I mean, in a sense, I've sort of said it in this conversation. You see, I've always been drawn to music, like many people are. I often believe I wasn't very musical, as in the West we are trained to be. We're trained not to believe that we're not rhythmic creatures. We're not artistic creatures because of the split between the science and the arts. I was brought up as a scientist. At my 11 plus, at 11 years old, I had to decide to be a scientist. But luckily I picked up a guitar as a hobby when I was about 14 or 15. So it kept me sort of balanced. And that side of me has always been important. I mean, that's what opened up in Ghana. When I came to Ghana, I was coming to finish a medical degree. I mean, it was music that opened up other doors to me. I really don't know what to say about music. It's a sort of, let me give you one example. I'm teaching some American students the Agbaja, polyrhythmic thing from Volta region, and one of them is telling me that she's not rhythmic. And I said, first of all, I said, I was like you when I came to Ghana. I had no sense of rhythm, but I said, think carefully about yourself. You walk, that's a rhythm. You breathe, that's a rhythm. You have a heart rate, that's a rhythm. You wake and sleep, that's a rhythm. And I said, there's research that's being done in Germany by a friend of mine who shows that even there are correlations between the breathing rate and the heart rate in the daytime and the evening. There are two interlocking rhythms that interlock over a period of a 24-hour period. So this is polyrhythms. It means we're not just rhythmic creatures, we're polyrhythmic creatures. So how can a culture tell you that you're not a rhythmic, you have no sense of rhythm, when we're actually rhythmic beings? And science is telling us that, you know, the universe is made of 10 different types of vibrating superstrings that vibrate in 10 different dimensions. And all the properties of matter and space and time are being generated by these theories. Well, it's harmonics. They have different harmonics. I mean, everywhere music you go from music, you stumble into something like a connection with mathematics, like Pythagoras. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians recognized this connection. That it actually connected with so many different things in life. And I personally just found that I probably wouldn't have woken up as such a musical person if I hadn't come to Ghana. Because in Britain I was playing rock and roll, either to pull a woman because I wanted to be a show-off, or it was to entertain people, right? I mean, those types of young men, macho reasons. But here I've seen all sorts of different sides of music. I've even realized that music it's opened up a spiritual dimension. So I'm not religious, I'm not really a Christian, but I actually pray by playing my guitar to myself. Sometimes I play the harmonica and the guitar at the same time. But to me, it's become a mantra. I don't play much in public now because I've got older, my bones are weaker and so on. But I still sometimes play as a prayer. And even if everything else disappears, music is a way which, if you use it as a prayer or prayer wheel, like the Buddhists and so on, that is enough. Even that is enough in your life. For a person who's not religious, who had Christianity beaten out of him when I was 14, I wasn't beaten out of me, but what I saw, you know, the hypocrisy that I saw, I couldn't remain a Christian.